Jack Smith's Deposition, Part 9: Distrust, Fraud, and Partisanship. Welcome to Law and Society. Remember to subscribe. What I'm doing right now is going through excerpts from Jack Smith's deposition before the House Judiciary Committee about Jack Smith's investigation and prosecutorial intentions of Donald Trump because of the January 6, 2021 riots and the fake elector scheme. And what I'll be doing, essentially, I'm doing this to remind everybody on this 5th anniversary of January 6th of what actually happened. And many other people are doing this similar thing. And I think that every American has a duty to remember the truth about what happened. So while Donald Trump's pardoned insurrectionists try to rewrite history, let's hold on to the truth and go back to the facts. I'll read out the questions and then Jack Smith's answers. This question's asked by Representative Crockett. Considering all the years of experience that you have prosecuting, is it more often or less often that you've had a defendant that has been charged in 4 different jurisdictions with crimes? Smith: I don't know if I have had that before, but it certainly hasn't been often. Question: returning back to January 6th, the conspiracy leading up, the events of January 6th. You said you charged the president that he was the most culpable person related to the crime of attempting to criminally overturn the 2020 election. Do you recall saying words to that effect earlier today? Smith: yes, and because we had proved beyond a reasonable doubt that met the requirements in the federal principles of prosecution. Question: you said some of the false claims he was putting out created a certain level of distrust about the validity of the election of 2020. Do you recall saying something like that as well? Smith: correct. That's alleged in the indictment. Question: so I want to start with how that level of distrust was created. In your report, you say the through line of all of Mr. Trump's criminal effort was deceit, knowingly false claims of fraud. Can you generally describe some of these knowingly false claims of fraud that were spread after the 2020 election? Smith: sure. There is a number of them. And part of the explanation is why they're false. Just off the top of my head, for example, there was he was on notice in this election in Pennsylvania, for example, that he would be ahead in the vote count for a period of time, and then when the mail-in ballots were counted, his lead would dissipate. He chose to represent that phenomenon and that he'd been briefed on. That was normal course of an election, that all sides knew that that's how it was going to be. He chose to present that as evidence of fraud. And to people who are not maybe as informed as him or informed as his campaign managers who told him these things, that sort of thing, that creates distrust. There were fraud claims in, Michigan, Georgia, where he was specifically disabused by people he trusted and by political allies, by people when he chose to call them who were best situated to know. In Georgia, I'm thinking the Secretary of State, he reflexively rejected those things and continued to state false things after he's been told repeatedly that they were not true. Question: why was it important, all of these repeat statements from individuals that Donald Trump's claims were untrue? How did that play into your overall investigative findings? Smith: well, I think the pattern and the depth of the pattern and the length of the pattern was pretty damning evidence that he knew these things were false. He only brought fraud claims that involved states that he lost. He only approached people generally who had party allegiance to him. When he was told that a fraud claim wasn't true, he didn't stop making it. Another example I can give is that Sidney Powell, who's alleged as one of the co-conspirators, was part of his team at the beginning of this conspiracy. Shortly after, she began making statements that really nobody could credit. They were facially false. And at some point, Giuliani made a statement that she wasn't on the legal team anymore. And Trump, at one point, was on a call, President Trump, where he, if I recollect it right, he muted the call and said she was crazy. But then, after that point, he continued to promote her fraud claims and lawsuits. He considered putting her as special counsel, even though he admitted he used the word crazy, and the statements she was making couldn't by any reasonable person be viewed as true. So I think that sort of claims that were so outlandish and so fantastical, continuing to push those sort of claims after they were disabused was strong evidence of our case. Question. I think you said Mr. Trump contacting mostly or all Republican officials about his voter claims for election of 2020. Is that correct? Smith, that's my recollection. As I sit here now, I can't think of anyone who wasn't someone who was loyal to him politically. And again, many people who would have been our witnesses rejected his entreaties to do that. And again, I think it was in Michigan and in Arizona, and also Attorney General in Georgia had stated, I voted for him twice. I wanted him to win. I campaigned for him. So it's not as if it was effective in every place, but that was who he focused this at. And that's why I said earlier today, the witnesses in this case, the subjects of the toll records in this case, were those chosen by Mr. Trump. So President Trump would have pressured, for example, a Democratic state leader about these claims of the election. Would you have looked into that Democratic state member as well? Smith, absolutely. Question. You've mentioned earlier talking about individuals pushing back on these claims. When you were talking about the fake electors, you mentioned a congressman from Pennsylvania who I guess might have been a witness who might have pushed back on the fake elector scheme being legal. Who was that member? Smith, to my recollection, I think his name was Thomas Marino. He was a former U.S. attorney, and he's a Republican and a former congressman. And he had agreed to be an elector for Donald Trump. And when he was presented with this idea of the fake elector scheme, my recollection of his reaction was that this was an attempt to overthrow the government and it was illegal. Question. You also mentioned a few of the states that Mr. Trump and his co-conspirators like Rudy Giuliani and Ms. Powell targeted about these claims, false claims about the election. Do you recall which states were the main target of this group? Smith. Yes, I believe it was 7 states: Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, New Mexico, and it was memorable because he'd lost that by 10 points, and then there was Nevada. Question. Did your investigation uncover why Mr. Trump and individuals like Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell might have selected these 7 states? Well, the states were all states that he lost by a pretty small margin, except for New Mexico, which was 10%. I mean, it depends on what you define as small, but the others were much closer than that. So with that, we come to the end of the 9th chapter, 9th portion of Jack Smith's deposition. Mind you, these portions I am making arbitrarily for my podcast and for you to break it down in small chunks. So you don't have to go through the whole thing, like be over an hour. What's the point of that? That's why I'm giving it to you in pieces. And so I'll come back again and talk to you more about the deposition in the next video. So thank you for listening. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon.